Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the call. I'm going to give it another minute and then we'll get started. I just want to give a little bit more time for more people to join before we jump in. Thank you. Okay, hi everybody. I'm Diane Yantel. I'm President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thanks for joining our weekly call on the HoUSed campaign for universal, stable, and affordable housing. We have another really busy, consequential week ahead of us. We are awaiting the Supreme Court's consideration of the federal eviction moratorium, where they have been asked to potentially remove the protections for low-income renters. And we're waiting to hear updates on that. Congress is back to potential negotiations around infrastructure spending package and much more. So I appreciate everybody joining today's call, and I very much appreciate our first speaker for joining us here today. And he is Senator Van Hollen. And I'm very pleased to welcome back Senator Van Hollen to our weekly call. He represents the state of Maryland in the U.S. Senate, where he serves on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. And in this role, he's advocated and led efforts for robust housing investments, especially to help ensure that children have access to affordable homes and high-performing schools. And he recently introduced major bipartisan legislation with Republican Senator Todd Young from Indiana to create 500,000 new housing mobility vouchers for families with young kids to help them move to communities of their choice. And this legislation, if enacted, would largely eliminate homelessness among families with young children, and it would substantially reduce the number of children growing up in areas of concentrated poverty. And his legislation is a major priority of both our HoUSed and our Opportunity Starts at Home campaigns. So Senator Van Hollen, thank you so much for your leadership, and thanks for joining us again. It's good to have you back. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, Diane, it's great to be back with you and with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for all your leadership, and to the entire coalition, thanks for everything you've been doing to keep people in their homes during this very difficult period we've been through with the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do want to start there because we did put in place, we the Congress and then the administrations, including the extension by the Biden administration, the eviction moratorium. That was a very important step. President Biden has extended it through the end of the month, although as you'll hear, there is litigation right now before the Supreme Court. But in addition to the eviction moratorium, we thought it was very important to include substantial rental assistance because at some point, the eviction moratoriums will come to an end, and we don't want people to face these gigantic balloon payments that they could not possibly afford, which is why both in the bill we passed in December, as well as more recently in the American Rescue Plan, we provided substantial rental assistance. Between the two plans, it was about $46 billion nationally. And as you know, local jurisdictions are working with both renters and with landlords to try to make that work. And anything you can do to spread the word and make sure that everybody's aware of that program, I think the better off we all will be. So thank you for those efforts. And of course, the American Rescue Plan also provides substantial and very flexible assistance to municipal governments, to local governments, to state governments, and they can also be using those funds, both for rental assistance, but for other housing needs that are related to the pandemic. And these funds are much more flexible than were the CARES funds passed just over a year ago. So I just encourage you to continue to look to state, local, and municipal governments for those resources on the housing front. But of course, we also need to keep our eye on the overall challenge of making sure that we address the affordable housing crisis in America, which pre-existed the pandemic and will continue after the pandemic if we don't do something about it. I do think we have an opportunity to do something about it with your engagement and leadership. And that is why I did just introduce last week the legislation that Diane mentioned, which is the legislation to provide families with young children with vouchers that allow them affordable housing in areas of greater opportunities. It's called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. I introduced it with Senator Young, Todd Young of Indiana. It's a bipartisan bill. It builds on a pilot program that we passed a number of years ago that included resources for, again, programs to demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach. And it's just proven so effective so quickly that we didn't think it was smart to wait any longer before we took this nationally. And the bill will expand vouchers by 500,000 and provide them to families with young children, specifically high need families. And it would provide pregnant women and families with a child under the age of 6 for the new vouchers if they have a history of homelessness or housing instability, if they live in an area of concentrated poverty, or at risk of being pushed out of an area of opportunity. This includes families who are victims of domestic violence, who are living in housing, or who are living in housing that is not accessible to a disabled family member. Very importantly, these vouchers are connected to wraparound services. So voucher recipients will receive mobility-related services, connecting them with transportation that will help with respect to access to the workplace, and also school and community-based supports. Again, this has been proven effective in those places that have used it, and so we want to take this national with your help. I'm pleased that in addition to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, this bill has been endorsed by other advocacy organizations as well. The NAACP, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, the National Association of Social Workers, Health Watch, Affordable Housing Conference in Maryland, and many others. So I really think we have an opportunity to get this over the finish line. It is bipartisan. It does meet an urgent need. And I look forward to our conversation or questions today. And just thank you again for everything you've done to help people during this pandemic, and for what you're going to do to help address the crisis in affordable housing going forward. We do need to increase the overall supply. That is a big part of President Biden's plan. It's one that I strongly support. But we also need to increase the affordable housing vouchers across the board, including this substantial jump in those provided to families with young children. So let me end there. And Diane, look forward to any questions people may have. Again, thank you all so much for what you're doing to tackle this really pressing issue.
Great. Thank you very much, Senator. We really appreciate your leadership and your important legislation, and are committed to working together to get it across the finish line. And so to that to that end, can you talk about some of the avenues that you think are the best to get this enacted? Certainly the infrastructure spending package seems like the best and most immediate opportunity. There's bipartisan negotiations that seem to stop and start. Can you tell us what you think is likely to happen with an infrastructure spending package, and how can we be sure that this legislation be included?
Well, I do think the infrastructure modernization plan is the best, most immediate vehicle in Congress to meet this need. And I am a big believer that when we talk about our national infrastructure, that should include our housing infrastructure and our affordable housing infrastructure. I was pleased that the president has included this as part of his plan, and I was pleased to see, Secretary Fudge, the Secretary of HUD, underscore that again in hearings before some of the committees that I serve on in the United States Senate. So there are these ongoing bipartisan negotiations. The first round really centered around discussions between President Biden and Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia. She's the senior Democrat, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. As you've probably seen, those talks did not advance because, as the president said, there was just a big gap and a disagreement on what the need is. And I agree with President Biden. The need is substantial, and it includes, of course, modernizing roads and bridges and expanding transit, very importantly. But it also includes things like affordable housing, high-speed internet access, making that universal, addressing our clean energy grid issues related to climate change, public schools, lots of critical parts of our national infrastructure. Right now, there is this other ongoing bipartisan effort. The details are quite murky. The one thing I've heard is they have not identified a new source of funding for any of their proposals. They are talking about clawing back some of the funds that we provided to cities and counties as part of the American Rescue Plan, which in my view would be a huge mistake because I know in the case of the state of Maryland, municipalities have already developed important plans for the use of those funds. And so I think it would be just wrong to take that money back for this other purpose. We should be adopting President Biden's approach, which is increasing the corporate income tax, closing these corporate loopholes that let multinational corporations park, billions of dollars overseas, as well as, make sure that very wealthy Americans are paying more for the common good. We saw the report just recently that some of the wealthiest people in the country are paying zero income taxes. So rather than take back money that has been allocated to cities which need it badly, we should expand our investment, and that should include the housing, the affordable housing piece. With your help, with the help of people on this call, we're going to push very hard to include that in whatever bill passes the Senate. It looks to me increasingly like that will have to be as part of what's called a budget reconciliation plan, which means we will need every one of our 50 Democratic senators on board if we're not able to get any Republican help. And so we could use your help in securing all the votes that we need.
Well, you can certainly count on us to do all we can to shore up support for this important legislation and for other big investments in affordable housing that are so badly needed throughout the country. So again, Senator Van Hollen, thank you so much for your leadership, and thanks for joining today's call.
Well, thank you, Diane, and to everyone listening. Thanks for what you do, and we'll get it done together. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
All right. You too.
Okay, so I wanted to give a few brief updates on the federal CDC eviction moratorium, and there are no major updates today, which I think is in this case a good thing, because we are waiting to hear the Supreme Court's response to an emergency petition before it. So just as a reminder, a little over a week ago now, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia ruled that it would continue a stay on a lower court ruling that sought to overturn the CDC eviction moratorium. So in other words, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled to keep the protections for the CDC eviction moratorium in place, at least until they can consider an underlying court case that seeks to overturn the moratorium. So that was certainly very good news and a relief for the millions of renters who remain stably housed today because of the protections under the CDC eviction moratorium. And that's about 6 million renter households who, according to recent Census Pulse survey data, report being behind on rent and are at heightened risk of eviction for when the moratorium is overturned or expires. So in response to the U.S. Court of Appeals ruling, a group that represents the interests of the landlord plaintiffs and is led by the Alabama Association of Realtors filed an emergency petition with the Supreme Court. And they're asking the Supreme Court to lift that stay and allow for the lower court's ruling to strike down the eviction moratorium and to have that take effect immediately. So the Department of Justice had until last Thursday to respond to the Supreme Court and to respond to that emergency petition. They did so. They responded at about 5 o'clock last Thursday. They continue to make a very strong case for why the moratorium is still needed and should be in effect and should be upheld. And at the same time, there were the attorneys general from 22 states also filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, urging them to uphold and extend the eviction moratorium. So that was really significant to have 22 states weighing in to say this eviction moratorium is important and should be upheld. So we're now waiting to hear the Supreme Court's response to this. And typically the Supreme Court issues their opinions or their responses on Mondays and Thursdays, Monday at 10 a.m., and they did not today. So we believe that that means the next we may hear from the Supreme Court on this would be Thursday at the earliest. But I think I've heard that it's also possible that the Chief Justice or all justices together could really respond to this at any time. So we are waiting eagerly to hear what the response is, and certainly we'll share with all of you as soon as we have any news. Of course, the possible outcomes are that they would lift the stay and eliminate the moratorium protections potentially immediately. But thankfully, many of the people I've talked with who watch the Supreme Court very closely think that that's unlikely. The other potential outcome would be for the Supreme Court to continue to keep the stay in place until the appeals court rules on the underlying case. So we, of course, are continuing to urge the Biden administration to defend, to enforce, and to extend the eviction moratorium. And we will keep you all posted on any updates on that. We are also, we have sent to the Biden administration a letter today urging that they extend the eviction moratorium along with a whole set of recommended actions and solutions that they take immediately to prevent evictions this summer. And I'll talk more about that letter in a moment. I want to first, because obviously the eviction moratorium and its importance is tied so closely to the success or not of emergency rental assistance programs. So I want to turn now to my colleagues at the coalition. I think Emma Foley is going to come up first to give an update on what we know about emergency rental assistance programs and how they're working so far. So Emily, I'll turn it over, Emma and Rebecca, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Yeh. I'm on the research team here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm going to give some brief updates on what's going on with Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Programs with my colleague, Emma Foley, today. Next slide, please. As of today, we're tracking 1,027 programs, 406 of which are from the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program. We've typically given a rundown of where programs are at and discussed kind of the share of programs that have adopted best practices and adapted to the new guidance, but you'll have to check out those numbers yourself on our online dashboard today, because we're taking a slightly different focus today, and that is to discuss state spending and sharing data on how program spending is going. Beginning on September 30th, 2021, the Treasury Secretary is required to recapture excess funds not obligated by a state or locality, and to reallocate those dollars to eligible grantees who, at the time of the reallocation, have obligated at least 65% of the amount originally allocated. In other words, ERA emergency rental assistance grantees must obligate at least 65% of their initial allocation by September 30th. We're very interested in seeing how programs are doing on this front in order to ensure that programs are serving tenants effectively, making sure that tenants are being served in a timely manner, as well as to ensure that they're on track for that September 30th deadline. The next slide, please. The Consolidated Appropriations Act requires the Treasury Department, in consultation with the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, to report quarterly at a minimum on how each emergency rental assistance grantee is using their funds. Each report has to include at least the number of households served, the acceptance rate for applicants, the types of assistance provided to each eligible household, the average amount of funding provided per household, the average number of monthly payments covered by the assistance, and income levels. The data collected must also be disaggregated by gender, race, and ethnicity of the primary applicant in the household. Next slide, please. The guidance also recommends that grantees collect the address of the rental unit for each application. For landlords and utility providers, the name, address, and social security number, tax identification number or DUNS number, amount and percentage of monthly rent covered by emergency rental assistance, amount and percentage of separately stated utility and home energy costs covered by the emergency rental assistance, total amount of each type of assistance provided to each household, amount of outstanding rental arrears for each household, the number of months of payments for which ERA assistance is provided, household income and number of individuals in the household, and gender, race, and ethnicity of the primary applicant for assistance. So aside from what the guidance tells grantees to collect per household, we don't have a clear picture of other ways aside from the indicators I discussed on the previous slide that Treasury might be asking grantees to slice, aggregate, and report data for its quarterly report. As I mentioned before, the Treasury Department is required to report this information at least on a quarterly basis, but we really haven't heard what has been happening with this information or when it will be available to the public. So NLHC is beginning to track state spending to better understand where programs are at. And so I'm going to pass it off now to my colleague, Emma, to discuss further.
Thanks, Rebecca, and great. So right now we have recorded 14 states that have publicly available data dashboards that are updated regularly with data from their emergency rental assistance programs. Right now, these states, they're listed on the slide, but they include Alaska, Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, Missouri, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, and Wyoming. From a very preliminary analysis of these dashboards and the data that they include, The average amount households are receiving from emergency rental assistance is around $4,834, though this varies widely across states. For example, the average household payment in Nebraska is around $2,630, while the average household payment in Connecticut is closer to $6,600. This variation is expected because of the differential cost of living across states and because programs vary in how many months assistance they provide. On average, the states together that we're tracking have dispersed about 13.6% of their emergency rental assistance allocation, though this also varies widely, which I will discuss on the next slide. So this table represents a snapshot of the small sample of state programs that we are able to track and how their spending is going. This table includes the amount of funding that has been either approved or distributed, the average amount of assistance approved per household, and the percent of a state's emergency rental assistance allocation that has been approved or distributed. The percent of funds that has been approved or distributed only includes 90% of the funds allocated for direct assistance and not the 10% allocated for administrative costs. So as you can see, states vary in how quickly they've been able to distribute this funding. The state of Texas, which had a very slow start distributing funds, has now approved or paid out about a third of their allocation. Alaska has approved or paid out 22% of their funding, and Maine has approved or paid out 14.3%. Other states have spent far less. Wyoming has only spent 0.1%, and Arizona, Colorado, Connecticut, Kansas, Missouri, and Nebraska have all spent less than 5%. Some of this variation might be due to the fact that programs started at different times, but this does not diminish the fact that from this sample of states, very few are operating at the speed necessary to reach the most marginalized renters. This is particularly critical, as Diana was discussing, as the eviction moratorium is set to expire at the end of June. The coalition will continue to track ERA spending, and we're aiming to get data for more states and localities in the coming weeks so that we can paint an even clearer, more comprehensive picture of the state of emergency rental assistance spending. And we will provide you all with updates as we have them and as that data is collected. And that's all we have for today.
Very good. Thank you, Emma and Rebecca. And I hope all of you listening and participating find this information as helpful as we do to begin to really get a sense of how the funds are being spent and where they are not being spent quickly enough, and therefore to think through what more needs to happen to get this money out to the renters and the landlords who need it to avoid evictions this summer. And certainly when we're seeing at least of the states that are reporting publicly their efforts, when we're seeing many of them spending less than 6 to 7% of their funds at this point, it's certainly troubling to know that the eviction moratorium expires in 2 weeks and they will not be able to spend enough money to get it to tenants who need it to stay stably housed and avoid eviction. And as Emma and Rebecca both said, I think there are a wide variation in reasons for delays, but there is no doubt that this money is getting out slowly and in some cases inefficiently, and changes are needed. So we have just this morning sent a letter to several cabinet secretaries, to Secretary Yellen, to Secretary Fudge, to the Secretary of the Department of Justice, Merrick Garland. We've sent it to the CDC director, the director of the Domestic Policy Council, the acting director of the CFPB, and to Gene Sperling, the senior advisor to President Biden. And in our letter, we are urging a few things. And I see Sarah Sadian is putting a link to the letter in the chat box. Thank you for that. So in the letter, we're urging that the eviction moratorium be extended, certainly, and that it should be extended. One, because while vaccination rates are up and caseloads are down for COVID-19, generally throughout the country. That's not true everywhere. And it turns out that in many of the communities that have low vaccination rates and high caseloads of COVID-19, those are also very often the same communities that have a large portion of renters who are at high risk of eviction when the moratorium expires. And in fact, the Eviction Lab just published new research today that verifies that. And we'll be having them on next week's call to talk about that more. But also we're urging that they extend the eviction moratorium because this money is available, but it hasn't reached renters yet. And so the eviction moratorium should be expired and should be extended until the emergency rental assistance reaches the tenants who need it to stay stably housed. We also put in the letter, and it's a 10-page letter with a lot of suggestions, but we also put in there, there are many more things that the administration can and should do to get these ERA funds spent more efficiently and more effectively, and to get them to the people who need it the most. So we talk at length in our letter about ways that the administration can help raise awareness of emergency rental assistance. We are finding and hearing that in many states and cities, it may be the case that renters and landlords don't know that the emergency rental assistance is available to them. So much more needs to be done in terms of public education, public awareness, and we give the administration some suggestions on how to do that, including bringing together a whole variety of stakeholders, whether state agencies, state governments, city governments, to landlord association, apartment associations, tenant organizers, and really urging and enabling and empowering them to get their networks engaged in getting more people connected to emergency rental assistance funds. We share some suggestions on what the administration can do to create or require or encourage more eviction diversion programs at the state and local level. And that is something that I know the administration is looking carefully at and giving close consideration to. And then all of the things that we think the administration can do more of to make it easier for state and local governments to spend the emergency rental assistance funds that we have. We know that there are a lot of program administrators who, for good reason, are reluctant to do more with their funds because they are worried about what consequences might come in the months or years down the line when an IG or a DOJ or some other entity weighs in and says, you spent this money incorrectly. So we are really encouraging the Department of Treasury to do more, to give more safe harbor to program administrators to do what they know needs to get done in order to spend this money quickly, and to lift up model ERA programs, which certainly do exist throughout the country. So we've shared that letter with all of you. We will be following up with the Biden administration to talk more in depth with them about these ideas and see what can happen in the next few weeks. Because again, there are 6 million renter households who report being behind on rent. And if the eviction moratorium expires before emergency rental assistance reaches most of them, then we will have an historic wave of evictions this summer and fall. And we have to do everything we can to prevent that. So we'll talk more to come on that, and we'll have Gene Sperling on the line in a little bit, not to talk about this, but to talk about stimulus checks for people experiencing homelessness. But I do expect we'll have him back in the future to talk more about what can be done to prevent evictions. So now I'm going to turn to another. Before we hear from Gene, I'm going to turn to my colleagues Kim Johnson and Elena Calabro to talk about another set of resources that is available in the American Rescue Plan, fiscal relief funds, $350 billion of which has gone to states and cities. And one allowable use of those funds is affordable housing, development, and in some cases, potentially even rental assistance. So Kim and Elena have been digging into the uses of these funds and how states are starting to use those funds. And they're going to talk a little bit about that and about additional guidance that we want to see from the Department of Treasury to make it easier for states to use these funds for that purpose. So Elena and Kim, I will turn it over to you.
Hi,
everyone. So yeah, I'll just provide a brief overview of the state and local fiscal recovery funds. The American Rescue Plan Act provides $350 billion in fiscal recovery funds.
Elena, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Elena, I can't really hear you. I think others can't as well. Can you try to turn your volume up?
Yeah, let me see.
That's better.
Is that better? Okay,
yeah.
Great. Okay, let me start over then. So I'll just provide a brief overview of the funds. The American Rescue Plan Act provides $350 billion in fiscal recovery funds to help states, counties, cities, and tribal governments respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency, address its economic fallout, and lay the foundation for an equitable recovery. So these funds, which are administered by the Department of Treasury, provide flexibility for governments to meet local needs, including by providing emergency rental assistance, addressing the housing and health needs of people experiencing homelessness, and building and preserving affordable housing in impacted areas. These funds, we believe, present a significant opportunity for communities to meaningfully address the systemic discrimination that has led to the pandemic's disproportionate toll on people of color, people with disabilities, immigrant communities, low-income households, and other historically marginalized groups. We're encouraging state and local governments to leverage these funds to prevent eviction and increase the supply of affordable housing for people with the lowest incomes. So communities can use these funds to provide rent, mortgage, or utility assistance, as well as counseling and legal aid to prevent eviction or homelessness. And Treasury's interim final rule identifies a broader range of services and programs that are eligible when provided in qualified census tracts or other disproportionately impacted areas, and when provided by tribal governments. So eligible housing investments that would fall under this category include supportive housing or other programs or services to improve access to stable, affordable housing among people experiencing homelessness, affordable housing development to increase the supply of affordable and high quality living units, and housing vouchers, residential counseling, or housing navigation assistance. So we put together a fact sheet kind of just providing a brief overview of the funds and the eligible housing and homelessness uses, and we'll put a link to that in the chat box. And we're also working on joint guidance right now with the National League of Cities, which will outline recommendations for state and local officials on using fiscal recovery funds for this purpose. And finally, we're also compiling examples of approved or proposed uses of funds for housing investments. So far, we know of 3 states we've confirmed, Illinois, Vermont, and Washington, that have approved using these funds for housing, but there are countless other states and localities who have proposed housing investments. So please let us know if your community is using fiscal recovery funds for housing. Let us know. My email, I believe, is up on the screen. We'd love to hear from you. And yeah, so we'll turn it over to my colleague Kim, who will discuss some concerns that have been raised about the funds, as well as our recommendations to Treasury.
Thanks so much, Elena, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm a policy analyst here at the Coalition. So like Elena was saying, Treasury's interim final rule on eligible uses for fiscal recovery funds is pretty broad, which gives states and localities a lot of flexibility in how they can use the funds, but also necessitates clarity for communities looking to use those funds in a specific way. With the help of our and input from our state and local advocates, we've been drafting a comment letter to Treasury requesting needed clarity for communities looking to use state and local fiscal recovery funds for affordable housing development. So first, we request that Treasury define development of affordable housing as the construction, preservation, rehabilitation, or operation of housing affordable to very low-income households, those earning less than 50% of area median income, and that they ensure the longest possible affordability period. We also encourage Treasury to require state and local governments to set aside a significant share of fiscal recovery funds used for affordable housing to be targeted to serve extremely low-income renters, and to ensure that at least 10% of any housing built with federal support is accessible to people with physical disabilities, and 4% accessible to people with sensory disabilities. Treasury should also explicitly state that fiscal recovery funds may be used to support operating expenses in permanent supportive housing and affordable housing developments. Expanding eligible uses of fiscal recovery funds to include operating expenses can help maintain long-term housing stability among the lowest income households. One of the most potentially problematic pieces of guidance restricted construction of new affordable housing to primarily qualified census tracts, or QCTs, which are concentrated areas of high poverty. This restriction threatens to reinforce the same housing segregation and patterns of racial discrimination the Biden administration has pledged to address by making it difficult to build deeply affordable housing in higher income neighborhoods with greater access to resources. A balanced approach in which resources that are both targeted to disinvested communities and affordable housing constructed in higher income areas with greater access to resources is central to the goal of reducing racial segregation and ensuring renters have the ability to choose where they want to live. To help undo racial segregation, Treasury should allow housing investments in any community, not just QCTs. And Treasury should also require grantees to follow the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule until HUD issues a revised version of the AFFH rule. Additionally, instead of focusing housing resources on particular geographies, Treasury should instead target housing investments to those households and populations disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So that includes people with the lowest income, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, people with disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, immigrants, and other communities that have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. Treasury should require housing development resources primarily benefit these populations and state in its guidance that any affordable, accessible housing that serves the lowest income renters automatically meets the statutory requirement to assist households disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And finally, we encourage Treasury to emphasize that communities can also use these funds to prevent evictions, including supporting legal aid attorneys, establishing eviction diversion programs, and supporting housing navigator programs to help tenants apply for and receive emergency rental assistance. So that's about it for me. Happy to answer any questions. And in the meantime, I'll turn it back over to you, Diane.
Great, thank you both. We did have a question, and I'll ask either one of you to answer on allocations for these funds and where people can find what those allocations are.
Yeah, I have the link pulled up from an earlier question. So I can just pop that link right into the chat. You will find all of the state allocations at the link that I just dropped in the chat. And you can find more about the program, including some of the territorial allocations at Treasury's website that I just dropped in the chat again.
Great, and there's also a question about the definition of affordable housing and whether it includes public housing or just privately owned housing in terms of allowable uses for these funds.
Yeah, so Treasury does not specify either way. In our guidance, we encourage Treasury to allow for the preservation of affordable housing as well. So I think that that would apply to publicly owned housing as well as privately owned housing stock that's affordable.
Okay, very good. One more question is, have we put our these recommendations to paper? And
We have.
the answer is yes. Go ahead, Kim.
Oh, yes, we have. We've been very busy writing letters left and right at NLIHC. And so we have those recommendations put together in a letter that we are going to be sending to Treasury.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Thanks, Elena. Okay, so I see, Mike Schmidt, that you've joined. Thanks for joining. I think we're still waiting for Gene to join. Is that right? He's still planning on joining. Okay, so while we're waiting, I'm going to answer a couple other questions that came in related to the emergency rental assistance. And we had that very helpful slide that Rebecca and Emma spoke to on spend down rates. And what how states are doing in terms of spending their emergency rental assistance funds. And the question from Judith Lieben, well, first the comment was to say how helpful that information is, and the question was, how can she access that information for local advocacy? And so one, we'll send out the slide deck to everybody on the call and to our full list after this call. And two, we have on our website, if you Google NLIHC rental assistance, you'll find a few resources. One is a comprehensive, easily searchable database of all emergency rental assistance programs. Another is a resource hub with useful tools for states and cities to use in their ERA programs. And then we also have a dashboard where we're tracking ERA programs by certain best practices and principles like direct tenant assistance and self-certification and all of the other helpful guidance that Treasury and the White House put out. We're tracking how programs are doing in terms of following that guidance. And soon we'll update that dashboard to include the information that we have on how states are spending the funds. So we'll make that publicly and easily available pretty soon. So I see now we have our next speaker, Gene Sperling, who's joined the call, and I'm very glad to welcome Gene back to our national call. He was on just about a month ago, talking about that incredibly helpful guidance that he and others at the White House and Department of Treasury put out related to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome him back to talk about his efforts and other efforts from others in the administration to ensure that stimulus checks can reach people experiencing homelessness who need that cash. And so Gene is formerly the head of the National Economic Council under Presidents Clinton and Obama, and he's the only person to ever hold that position under two presidents. And now he is a senior advisor to President Biden, who appointed him to oversee the implementation of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, including, of course, the new resources for emergency rental assistance, which he's worked hard to ensure that it reaches the tenants who need it the most. And also in the American Rescue Plan, of course, were the stimulus checks. And everyone on this call knows some of the difficulties that people who are homeless have faced in accessing those checks. And Gene has been working hard to ensure greater access. So he's here to share an update on progress. So Gene, thanks very much for joining, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. This is just more of a drive-by, but I'll be back for more discussion. First of all, let me just do a quick things to come. I want people to know that we don't for 1 second think that what we did on May 7th is the end. We have quite good evidence, growing evidence, that the guidance on May 7th, which the Low Income Housing Coalition and so many of you influenced, in fact, so much of it was in response to things you gave, there's no question it is working. There's no question it is working to a degree, making things better. There's also no question that none of this is happening fast enough or quick enough as we need, particularly if we do end up facing the end of the CDC eviction. So I want you to know that in the next, I don't want to make a specific commitment, the next couple of weeks, we will be back to describe other things we are doing. We're plotting and strategizing and listening to things that you all are saying, but we will be doing our best to have more to say and to have what we think is a strong all of government approach and a very strong message to support eviction diversionary strategies and to make clear what the resources are in the American Rescue Plan for doing so. So that is my well, it's like the trailer in a movie, you know, that's to come. But I want people to know we are actively working on more. And once we have it, I will happily return with a full briefing on that. What I did want to say today, because I feel like people on this call were influential in this, is I do think the place where we in the White House American Rescue Plan team, with help from our colleagues at Treasury, made a very, very big difference on the child tax credit is in getting a non-filer sign-up portal. I do not believe that was in the works. I know it was not in the works. And we pushed very, very hard. From my perspective, you know, we can't always go as much directly to the IRS. So we work together with our folks at Treasury. We go back and forth, back and forth. We did that over many, many weeks. Real thanks to some of our Treasury colleagues like Mark Mazur and Tom West and Adam Cole and others for helping that. But in the end, we ended up getting the what is now going live today, a child tax credit sign up, non-filer sign up portal, which should have basically the same simplicity that the non-filer portal did. Now, as soon as we won this victory, we of course proved that you could never satisfy us, because I had gotten so many messages directly and through Diane, particularly from those worried about those who were without homes, who had not gotten the stimulus checks and would perhaps lose that opportunity if there was not another sign-up portal. So here's the key, because we ended up prevailing on that. Now this will, it's important that you all know the following, that even though what went up today will be described as a new non-filer sign-up portal for the child tax credit, it is also a non-filer portal sign-up for the most recent recovery rebates or stimulus checks or EIP, whatever you want to call them. So this means two things. This means if a family with children goes on that had not filed in 2019 or 2020 and makes under $24,000 as a joint couple, or the proportional amount for a single or head of household, that not only will they be able to get the child tax credit, but let's say that a parent with 3 children signs up for the first time, they could not only get the child tax credit, which could be worth $9,000 to $10,000 to them, they would also, through that same process, get the previous stimulus check. So if you can imagine, for 4 in a family, that would be $8,000 for the last 2 stimulus checks, plus perhaps $9,000. A huge amount for families struggling, $15,000, $17,000, in some cases $20,000. So this sign-up portal is extremely important, and those signing up for the child tax credit for the first time will also get to be able to get their stimulus check. But what's important for people to know, and those of you who are trying to ensure that those who are homeless get checks, is that even if you are not applying for the child tax credit, you can, as of today, use this non-filer sign-up portal to get your a missed stimulus check from the previous one. So if somebody missed the $1,400 check, they can still get it. And it will be very clear that you do not have to put your own address, that you can put a trusted address in there, such as a community center, a shelter, etc. So I wanted people to know this for a few reasons. One is that I'm not sure that I would have been so incentivized to push for this if I had not been pushed on it, and if the case had been made to me about those who are homeless. And this was arguments I used in doing that. So one, thank you. I think this wouldn't have happened without people on this phone. But secondly, it is important to know that it might not be obvious to people that a single individual can get their recovery rebate or EIP3 or whatever you want to call it, even if they're not filing for the child tax credit. So I wanted those here to know this can be used, and we very much hope it will be. And I wanted to. We now have another person besides the people I mentioned at Treasury who did so much. Michael Schmidt is now coming on to really help with the American Rescue plan, and he is both working for Treasury, but he's also working hand in glove with me. We are, for example, having a Child Tax Credit Awareness Day on Monday. We want people to participate in that. We want groups, members of Congress, elected officials. If you have questions, would like to participate, would like to be part of events or announcing plans you're going to do, please let us know. We want to show across the country that there is how much widespread support there is for the child tax credit. But I also wanted to give Michael the floor just to, so you both have his contact at Treasury, but also, Mike, if you wanted to add or subtract to anything I said about individuals who weren't filing for the child tax credit being able to still get a past stimulus payment.
Thanks, Gene. So everything Gene said is exactly right, and we are very excited gearing up for Child Tax Credit Awareness Day on the 21st, which we are hoping will be a real kind of galvanizing moment around this issue, and galvanizing not only for people who receive the child tax credit, but also for people who could receive their economic impact payments. And to be clear, what we're talking about is not only the recovery rebate credit, right, which is the payment of the first two economic impact payments, but also allowing you to then receive EIP 3, the $1,400 check. So as Gene said, just a really meaningful amount of support for families. We're launching this. We've been pushing hard to move this forward, but we also want to get your feedback. We want to make sure that we're providing materials and support and incorporating your feedback into our efforts to the extent we can. This is going to be an iterative exercise as we try to serve low-income communities to the extent possible. And it's really it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So we're gonna focus on June 21st. We're gonna raise awareness, but really over the course of the coming months, we want to have a steady drumbeat to try to get people signed up. Thanks, Gene.
Well, thanks so much, Gene and Michael. That's a tremendous improvement. And there are many people writing in the chat box and the Q&A there. Thanks for this improvement and for making these stimulus checks that much more accessible to people experiencing homelessness. I just want to call out Brooke Evans, who is on the line, who is a person who has experienced homelessness herself, who is saying that these the non-filer portals are essential, and thanking you both for hearing the feedback and the input from homeless Americans and making this change. There's also, I just want to read one comment. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, from Sarah Hasper, who's urging you not to make any non-filer portals take away the individual's free online fileability for the next tax year. And that what happened last year was that the VITA sites had to send paper filings for people who used the stimulus portal in 2020. So please don't have that happen again, is what Sarah is saying. And Brooke again is saying that, yeah, that was very inefficient. So please to make sure that that doesn't happen. Beyond that, we have a lot of requests for how to link up to the portal, which we'll send out. There's a couple of questions about the conversation that you mentioned that's happening on Monday and whether people can sign up to participate in that, and what, if any, hashtag you're using for Child Tax Credit Awareness Day that others can engage in.
That is on us to come back with a hashtag. I try to take care of everything, but I'm going to need to talk to our communication folks on that. We want people out there. I never hide my email if people want to let me know, particularly if they think that they can have organize events or announcements, but it's just Eugene.b.Sperling, Eugene.b.Sperling at who.eop.gov, Eugene.b.Sperling at who.eop.gov. That is my only email address, so it's not, that's it. But I will And then I can get you in touch with Deidre Schliffling on our team, who's coordinating a lot of the groups, does a tremendous job, but we're all working together on that. I want you to know, looking at some of the chat, that we are going to have, it will be up in a matter of hours, a childtaxcredit.gov. And so in other words, you won't have to send somebody just to the non-filer portal. You can send them to childtaxcredit.gov. It will be a friendlier landing page. It will still connect people to the non-filer portal. But for example, one of the things it will do is it will make clear something the IRS portal won't do, but ours will make clear. This does not count as income. It will not affect your ability to get benefits, to be on SSI or WIC or TANF or SSDI. We know that's been a hesitancy for some people. So, and again, as Mike said, this is iterative. That's something we put on because we heard from our outreach that that was a concern people had in filing. But it's going up this week by the Child Tax Credit Awareness Day. We will also have a Spanish. We will also have it in Spanish. We're sorry that can't move quicker, but we'll try. But again, as Mike said, we want to, this is iterative. It's a long basis, and us having a childtaxcredit.gov gives us a base to have a central place and to be a living website where when we hear things that are confusing or where another Q&A is needed, we can add, we can respond and add to it.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate you joining the call to share this announcement. Really helpful information. We'll certainly do everything we can to distribute it with our network, and I know they'll share it even further out. And Jean, we'll look forward to having you back sometime soon to talk more about eviction diversion and emergency rental assistance.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you both.
Thanks, Diane. Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn now to our next speaker, who is Genevieve Kenny from the Urban Institute. And she's joining us to share some findings from recent research on immigrant families' access to COVID assistance programs. Genevieve, thanks so much for joining. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking all of you for the important work that you're doing. I'm really grateful to have a chance to share findings from a recent report that was funded by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation and led by Urban Institute colleague Jennifer Haley and jointly done with Hamatal Bernstein and Dulce Gonzalez. The next slide provides a little background on the data and the methods. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I think it's important to describe that our survey was fielded in December of 2020. It was administered in English and Spanish, and it's based on a nationally representative sample of over 1,000 non-elderly adults who are foreign-born or who are living with a foreign-born relative, who also have a child under the age of 19 living in the household. We looked at the so-called chilling effects, that is the avoidance of public and other benefits and other assistance because of concerns about adverse implications for green card status or other immigration concerns. And we also assessed rates of hardship and worries about ability to meet basic needs. I think it goes without saying that understanding how the pandemic has been playing out is critical for families with children, and particularly important to understand what's been happening in immigrant families with kids. So the next slide briefly mentions the three groups that we focus on. In particular, we assess patterns across the immigrant families in which all members are naturalized citizens. We look separately at those in which all are permanent residents. And then finally, we look separately at those at least where in which at least one non-citizen family member is not a permanent resident, with the idea being that that last group would be the one most likely to experience chilling effects, and the first group be the least likely to do so. The next slide describes some of the limitations of the analysis. I'll just focus on a few, highlight the fact that we are excluded from including respondents who's with limited English or Spanish proficiency. We have a low response rate, although we've done a lot of analysis that gives us confidence in our ability to generalize despite the low response rate. And then we were talking to families in December of 2020. And of course, there's been a lot of change since then, including a new administration. So our focus is really on providing a snapshot of what was happening for families then and in 2020. Okay, so what did we find? The next slide shows the extent to which these immigrant families were experiencing some kind of chilling effect or avoidance of government, non-cash government assistance or other assistance. We found that 1 in 5 adults in immigrant families with kids said that either they or a family member had avoided some type of non-cash government benefits or other assistance in the past year. That share rises to close to 30% when we zero in on the low-income immigrant families with children specifically and exclude those with higher incomes. When we drill down and look at the specific benefits that are being avoided, SNAP actually is being avoided at the highest rate, Medicaid and CHIP after that. But when we look at housing assistance, we're also seeing families reporting that they're avoiding that as well because of immigration concerns. Overall, 7.2% of the immigrant families with children were reported to be going without either emergency rental assistance or housing subsidies because of concerns about immigration. We have a parallel analysis that focuses on low-income immigrant families with and without children. I'm happy to put that in the chat when we're done. What's striking, if you look at the next slide, is that we're finding these rates of public avoidance, which are high, at the same time that these families were experiencing hardships at high rates. So for example, 45% of the adults in immigrant families with children said that they or a family member had lost income or work over the course of the pandemic. And 38% were worried about being able to pay their rent or mortgage in the next month. I'm just highlighting a few of the stats there, but you can see there are concerns about ability to meet other basic needs, and 28% having reported food insecurity in the prior year. The next slide shows the pattern across the 3 different groups of immigrant families, and it really did play out as we expected. So that the adults living in families where there are 1 or more non-permanent resident had the highest rates of avoidance of non-cash benefits or other forms of assistance. That's that 42.3% number that you see there. If you go down and look at the 2 hardship measures I pulled out, I'm not cherry picking. The pattern would have been the same had I showed you the hardships that relate to health or healthcare access or food security, but you can see that those same immigrant families are experiencing significant challenges meeting their rent or mortgage obligations. They did in 2020, And then I think the big wow number for me is the over half, 52%, that as of December, said they were really worried about being able to pay their rent or mortgage in the next month. It's important to note that we're seeing program avoidance, public assistance, avoidance of assistance in all three of the subgroups of immigrant families we looked at. And we're seeing hardships as well. But it's the group with the non-permanent residents that both avoided public benefits and other forms of assistance at the highest rates, and we're experiencing hardships at the highest rates. So I want to close by pointing to the next slide, some of the policy areas that we think need attention. And I'm glad to pick up more on this in the Q&A, but I want to leave time for all the great other speakers you have coming up. So with that, I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Genevieve. This is Paul Keeley. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I'm going to jump in here because Diane had to jump off to have a follow-up conversation with Gene Sperling. I just want to thank you so much for this research. We featured it on our memo to members and partners e-newsletter. It's so important. The policy implications and what we all need to do to overcome these issues are so important. And you know, everyone on this call really needs to take action to ensure that this avoidance does not continue, because obviously their hardships are great, and we need to make sure that they get the assistance they need. I don't have any questions in here. There was a question for a link to your report, which we've included. But again, I just want to thank you so much for sharing these details on the call today. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for giving me the chance.
All right, fantastic. So let's see, I think that our next speaker on our call here is from Field Updates and Markia, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing that, but I may be. Watson from Greater Kansas City Coalition to End Homelessness. Take it away, Markia.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me see. Okay, you can go ahead and advance the slide. So I kind of set this up as a general kind of level set to identify how we had utilized CARES Act funding, and then to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of distributing and administering the federal rental assistance. And so kind of at the outset, I think that, you know, obviously all of us were in panic mode and trying to figure out how to very quickly stand up a response to what we perceived as the likelihood of, you know, massive housing instability, and then simultaneously kind of juggle the need to deal with people who have been housing unstable and even chronically homeless for a long time. And so we focused on emergency housing of various types, emergency housing for families with children, and those who needed isolation and quarantine space during the pandemic, people who were presumed positive for COVID-19 or just had reasons for which they were unable to shelter in place in a traditional setting. At the beginning, we also looked at mobile medical outreach and the need for, you know, disseminating more information, both from the healthcare perspective, but also just general outreach and education about the pandemic and what was even going on. Because, you know, we understood very quickly that people living outside were in an information void and weren't getting ready access to information about the virus. We looked at case management and kind of, you know, a lot of agencies went home at the beginning of the pandemic out of necessity. Many of our, you know, case managers and certainly those who do street level engagement come from within the healthcare sector. And so they had to take an abundance of caution at the beginning of COVID and start working remotely. And so we needed more boots on the ground and more boots in the agencies that were still open. Obviously, supplies and equipment were the order of the day, and certainly we all remember, you know, 14 months ago when you couldn't even buy hand sanitizer at the store, and so we were utilizing resources for that, as well as just general transportation, logistics, and hazard pay. And you can move the slides, please. Next, okay, thank you. And so simultaneous with like thinking about, we're in the like immediate blast zone of a crisis, we've also got to always be thinking upstream. And so thinking about eviction prevention and, how we can prevent people in terms of advocacy and education, and, really tapping into their own strengths and their own resources to stay housed. That's always kind of the place that we want to be in. And I think that even though this is such a painful moment right now, trying to figure out logistically how to uncluster, all of this federal relief that's coming and really build the capacity to administer the funds, prevention is where it's at. And so we always want to be looking at upstream and figuring out, where we can predict homelessness, we can prevent it. And so if we know who is most likely to become homeless, whether it's, because of economic reasons, this other kinds of disenfranchisement, racism, all the other isms, we still know that we need to have data. We need to collect information on people to better understand the problem, but also better understand what the tipping point looks like for people as they're entering homelessness. And so to that end, we decided in Kansas City that we needed to create a universal application portal for federal rental assistance, because we understood very early on that we didn't want to piecemeal a prevention response together. We understood that the prevention is really the long game, and this is a unique opportunity, as awful as it is for all of us, to endure the kind of horrors of being in a pandemic situation, that we've not seen something like this in the modern era of homelessness, where we could actually look at numerical data and identify who needs our help and why and when, and how do we intercede before they know that those things are even happening. And so we invested soon and early into this universal application portal and really thinking about data capture, reporting, and analysis, which I think has positioned us nicely, even though we're still kind of in the muck. At the same time, again, we're always thinking about the people who fall through the net, whether those are people who need temporary type of housing accommodations or, emergency shelter of various kinds. We invested a lot of resources into hotel shelters. That was, at the discretion of our mayor to decide that he wanted to en masse shelter everyone who was living outdoors at the time, and then to start to really think about, long-term solutions once people were already in shelter. It's kind of the pinnacle of what we think of when we talk about housing first. Next slide, please. We've had the opportunity to really start to develop and implement some of the kind of more grandiose concepts that we've thought about, where we think about anti-homelessness work and how we can work in tandem with our social services community, our medical and behavioral health community, and really create, on-the-ons for people to have housing infrastructure, but also access to additional resources. And so COVID-19 has really presented an opportunity to think longitudinally about a person's pathway out of homelessness and where that starts, where that ends, where it begins, kind of where it concludes, like all those kind of things. And so we've created a homeless navigation center in Kansas City. It's a repurposed hotel that is now kind of the epicenter for all of the sheltering that we're doing en masse in conjunction with the efforts of our mayor and city manager. I'm super excited about that. We obviously modeled it after Project Roomkey and what we're doing in San Francisco and the Bay Area around navigation centers, and just repurposing existing infrastructure to make it something new. And coincidentally, it's in environments where people who are experiencing homelessness have, that kind of made their stomping grounds. And so it's germane to their experience and their existence. And so that's where we've created this opportunity. We're working on tenant advocacy and working with partners in our legal community, obviously the federal rental assistance, which is the question of the day, and then really trying to figure out how to meaningfully bring people with lived experience and with expertise into the space, and really talking about racial equity and kind of all of the isms that are driving this problem. And so we do have, you can advance this slide. We do have some kind of more future-oriented things that we'd like to pursue with help from, our partners at the federal government, but also thinking about, tax levies or other types of funding mechanisms to convert hotels into single-room occupancy apartments. That's one type of housing infrastructure that we don't have in Kansas City that is in high demand. We have a lot of single individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Actually, about nearly 70% of our unsheltered population are single people who are not accompanied by children. We also have an aging homeless population, so people who are, I consider people who are 50 plus, 55 plus, if they're living outside to be senior citizens. But just in general, this problem is, it's getting to be, 40, 45 years of, a standing unsheltered homeless population that we're seeing in the United States. And so those people are aging into older age, living outside. We're looking at a school building, a really beautiful school building that potentially could be a converted apartment home community for seniors and youth with children. Really ramping up a more robust housing trust fund for the community, thinking about targeting prevention resources, using geospatial data, because we've had the opportunity through our HUD Continuum of Care program, NOFA, and now through the ERAP program, to start really thinking about space and kind of looking at how we allocate resources in a kind of three-dimensional space, and how we're not hitting the mark in certain jurisdictions, certain zip codes, where people are flooding in the door from certain zip codes because they simply don't have a safety net in those communities, and really trying to think about, okay, we saw what happened after Hurricane Katrina, we saw what happened after 08, 09. We see now in the homeless sector that there are still people who are experiencing homelessness from those times. And so how can we think differently about shoring up the safety net in those communities, because we want to prevent people's homelessness and the trauma of homelessness wherever possible, and not be thinking about band-aiding a shotgun wound. And then lastly, we're talking about mobile technology for street outreach, because the unsheltered population, surprisingly, is the population that we know the least about. And so I think in terms of how we could make distributing or administering the federal rental assistance funds easier, we certainly need more stringent policies, or more of a clear line of sight between where the end of a tenant's rights and a landlord's rights kind of intersect. There's a lot of illegal eviction in Kansas City, and so, but for non-payment of rent, people are evicted for all sorts of reasons right now. Some of those reasons are made up or unfounded, and I think that folks, especially those who are living in poverty, and I've had this experience myself where you feel so depleted and so disempowered by the system that you don't really quite know what your rights are, but you kind of have this sense that no matter how hard you fight, you're not going to be able to win. And so we really do need more clear guidance around how landlords actually can effectively evict a person in the context of, this kind of moratorium pandemic situation, even though it's about to expire. There still remains a lot of confusion and I think fear and trepidation around eligibility and programs that are, typically distributing financial assistance, emergency rental assistance, and debt relief of various types. They're very concerned with compliance, and for good reason. But I think there's a lot of, hesitation around just kind of getting the money out the door, because they don't want to end up, twisting in the wind, waiting to be reimbursed, or also potentially for a big brother to come back and smack them down should they misappropriate or spend funds incorrectly. And so I think that's a paradigm shift that also kind of needs to happen, because, it's not just a regular Sunday afternoon. We're in the midst of a crisis, but also, more guidance around how we can work around those kind of more stringent requirements would be super helpful. We've seen that there is definitely a digital divide, and certainly in communities of color and low-income communities. And so, we've created this fancy universal application platform online, but tech literacy and tech access are big issues and continue to be so. And I think that what goes for urban America, urban poor America, also goes for rural poor America. And so we, again, as always, find ourselves in the same boat together. And so if we're thinking about, the broad scope of how to address this issue, we have to think that there are a lot of people who simply do not have the access to the technology or the understanding of the technology to really be able to take part. And then just the big enchilada here, I think, is that administrative capacity is a huge problem. And, we've had a lot of resources come through the CARES Act into continuums of care. And there's a mandate that many of those funds are administered through the coordinated entry process. but there's no additional resources to staff coordinated entry, which across the nation, I would wager is underfunded anyway. In our community's case, we've been asked to prioritize more people through a system that was already bottlenecked and where we did not have enough staff to make credible referrals for people who are the most vulnerable who need housing. I was on a call with our emergency rental assistance providers just an hour ago, and the data firm that's working with us on our application said that if we keep working at the pace that we're on, and mind you, we're on the naughty list that I saw of states that are underspending. If we continue to spend at this pace, it will take us 13 weeks to spend down our funds. And we've got 2 weeks left, and the clock is ticking. And I think it's not a matter of, spending down the money. It's a matter of intervening before people lose their home, because ultimately the human cost and the fiscal cost for all of us is incalculable. And so that's really what we need to be thinking about, is how do we ramp up staff so that we can actually deliver services in a timely and appropriate manner that is trauma informed, that reduces harm, and it really is about lifting people up. And that's what I've got for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Markia. Markia, I'm very cognizant about the time. We're getting close to the end of the time that we have available for our other speakers. There are a few very good questions in the Q&A box and in the chat. If you have time to address those, that would be great. Or at the very least, maybe you could leave your email with those folks and follow up with them later on. But I do want to now move on to our other speakers. We are approaching 4 o'clock, and I do want to just say to our remaining speakers that if you're not able to stay on a few minutes after 4 and you have to drop off, we promise we will get you on a future call to give us an update. And so with that, I will turn to Matthew Campbell and Sarah Miller. Matthew from Mississippi NAACP and Sarah from Hope Policy Institute. Do you have time to stay on for a few minutes?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Thanks so much for having us. Mississippi has 3 rental assistance programs, one statewide, one in Hinds County, which is around Jackson, Mississippi, and one in Harrison County on the Gulf Coast. We convened a group of several statewide and local organizations that meet regularly about these rental assistance programs, and starting with outreach to the administering agencies before the programs opened to share best practices for the program, and have continued monitoring and outreach, helping to troubleshoot issues with applications and documentation and things like that. And while doing that work, we found that the Hinds County program was asking for documentation of Social Security cards, proof of citizenship, or legal alien status for all members of an applicant's household. We brought up with them that we did not believe that it was legal to impose an immigration status or Social Security number requirement, because the federal law and guidance for the program doesn't include restrictions for immigration status. And they did eventually remove that requirement, as well as some other documentation requests that we felt were unnecessarily burdensome. And they've streamlined their documentation requests a bit. For the state program has had a systems glitch. So they haven't gotten out very many payments that we know of yet, despite opening March 29th. They did still seem to be able to take in applications during that time. And they say they're now up and running. So hopefully payments will start going out more rapidly for the state program. In contrast, Harrison County's program, Harrison County contracted with the Open Doors Homeless Coalition, which is a local continuum of care agency. And they've gotten about half of their initial funds out and started releasing payments within 2 weeks of opening. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matthew, who's going to talk about some of the outreach and engagement that we've done in Mississippi.
Thanks, Sarah, and good afternoon, everybody. Matthew Campbell, community organizer with the Mississippi NAACP. And when we first started doing this work back in February or March on the various rental assistance programs across the state with HOPE and some other community partners, we noticed that there were problems with insufficient outreach and accessibility, especially for folks in some of the rural parts of the state that might not have access to Wi-Fi, so they're unable to fill out online applications. And so we began to work with HOPE and also some of our local branches, specifically our local branches in Hinds and Harrison County on community outreach events. And so both of our local branches in Harrison County, the Biloxi branch and the Gulfport branch, held community outreach events about the rental assistance program there. They then followed up those community education events with application intake sessions. And a program administrator in Harrison County, like Sarah just mentioned, Open Doors, was a big part of those community education events, as well as those application intake sessions. Both of our branches in Hinds County, the Jackson branch and the Clinton branch, also held a community education event about the rental assistance program there. And right now we're working with HOPE on two community outreach events in the Mississippi Delta. The Mississippi Delta is one of the most impoverished regions in the state, where housing instability is a major issue. And so we're looking forward to that work as well. And thanks for having us today.
Thank you so much, Matthew and Sarah, for that presentation. And I want to go back and thank Markia for your phenomenal presentation as well, and really for the great work that all of you guys are doing. Thank you so much for your efforts, and thank you for joining us on today's call. I don't have any questions in the box for you, but many, many thanks from Jerry Pohe, which I echo. I will turn now for a brief update from Sarah Sadian, our Vice President for Public Policy. Sarah, you still there? I'm wondering if Sarah had to drop off.
Sarah's there, she's on mute.
Oh, there you go. Okay. Take it away, Sarah.
Thanks so much. Okay, so this week is a really pivotal week on Capitol Hill, especially in regards to the infrastructure bill. We've talked about before about how congressional leaders are still negotiating to see if a bipartisan deal can be reached. That is still ongoing. So just a quick update about where we are. Last week, President Biden ended his talks with Senator Capito from West Virginia after they couldn't reach enough common ground. Democrats started publicly calling for time for Congress to shift its focus to using budget reconciliation so they can pass a bill with only Democratic votes. And then at the very last minute, a bipartisan group of 10 senators announced late Thursday that they came up with their own deal, although few details have been released just yet. Overall, that package is supposed to be about $1.2 trillion. But only $600 billion of it is new spending, and it's unclear whether or not that's enough to pull in Democrats to sign off on a deal like this. We do know that a little bit about what the pay-fors might look like, and this is something that I think folks on this call are going to be really interested in. Susan Collins from Maine over the weekend said that the deal would be paid for in part by unspent pandemic relief money. Now, she wasn't specific about which sources in the American Rescue Act would be clawed back, but it seems like reading between the lines of what she said that she's talking about state and local fiscal relief funds like the ones that my colleague spoke about earlier on this call that could be used for affordable housing development. In that bipartisan deal, we don't expect housing to be included. But whether or not it moves forward, it will have a big impact on whether or not we can get an economic recovery bill that includes housing passed later on. So What we're hearing now is that McConnell is open to supporting this bipartisan package. Essentially, he's daring President Biden to oppose it. Some are suggesting that the reason why he is offering tentative support to this package is to further fracture Democrats and to spur on sort of those frustrations among progressives who are upset about the pace of these bipartisan talks and how long they're going on for. Some Senate Republicans have told reporters that they think that passing a smaller infrastructure-only traditional infrastructure bill will make it harder to pass an economic recovery bill that's much broader. So that's something that we're definitely worried on. We've talked about that a couple of times over the last several weeks. And so it's sort of on congressional leaders to make a decision about how to go forward. For right now, at least, Senator Schumer, who's the majority leader, has said that they're going to continue to move forward on a two-track process, one looking to see if bipartisan deals are still possible, and the other to move forward with budget reconciliation. So this is a really pivotal time. It's important that you continue to contact your members of Congress to talk about why housing is infrastructure and to voice support for all of the priorities that we're pushing on together. Also, if you haven't signed on to our sign-on letter, I encourage you to do that. We have over 1,000 organizations signed on, but we want to keep building that support. So I'm going to ask a colleague of mine if they can put it in the chat box. I also wanted to give an update about two bills that are ongoing. One, Chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, Maxine Waters, is soon going to formally introduce her universal housing voucher entitlement bill. They had a hearing last week that it was a little rough at first, but it got better towards the end. This is a bill that would essentially create and phase in an entitlement program over the next 10 years. It also includes a lot of reforms that we've been pushing for, like banning source of income discrimination, putting more money towards fair housing enforcement, using small area FMRs, et cetera. When that bill is out, though, we'll want to build congressional support for it. So I want to encourage, just put that on your radar, and also to encourage you that if you're a member of a national organization that you think should be signing on in support of the bill or endorsing the bill, if you could reach out to them, that'd be great, and have them contact us and we can get them added to the list. And then finally, I just want to give a little more updates on the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act that Senator Van Hollen spoke about earlier on today's call. Just a couple more details. The bill would create 500,000 new housing vouchers, specifically targeted to pregnant women and families with children under the age of 6 who have a history of homelessness or housing instability, who live in an area of concentrated poverty, or who are at risk of being displaced from, for lack of a better word, a high opportunity area. Those vouchers would be paired with mobility counseling and services and phased in over 5 years. It's something that you can already start to build congressional support for. If you reach out to your senators and ask them to co-sponsor, that would be great. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And I will just tell everybody that you may have guessed that unfortunately our speaker from New Jersey did have to drop off. We'll be circling back with them to get them on a future call. But I just want to thank everybody for participating, all of our panelists. Please join us for next week. We're going to have Richard Cho, Senior Advisor at HUD, joining us. We'll have somebody from Eviction Lab talking about their latest research that Diane mentioned earlier on. And we'll have other excellent speakers on next week's call. So please join us for next week's HoUSed national call. And have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.